The Kalb Report is produced by the George Washington University, the National Press Club, and the Joan Shorenstein Center at Harvard University. The series is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Kalb Report here at the National Press Club, which is now celebrating its 100th birthday. I'm Marvin Kalb, and our subject tonight is democracy and the press. Our guest is Katie Couric, the anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News and a correspondent for 60 Minutes. So I'm going to call you Katie and not Miss Couric, because everybody else does.
That's fine, Marvin.
And that's right, you can call me Marvin. But I think you'll agree that these are momentous times in Iraq and in the United States, and the war's at the top of our national concerns. You are not a war correspondent, but you were in Iraq recently doing a full week of what might be called war reporting from Baghdad and Damascus, and I believe it was your first visit to Iraq, right?
That's right.
I'm curious, now having seen it, having talked to the troops, having listened to the generals, do you think that the American people are being given the straight story, the truth, about what is happening in Iraq?
I think the truth of what is happening in Iraq is incredibly complicated and also incredibly nuanced. And I think it would require reading sort of 24/7 every publication with various points of view to really understand fully the situation in Iraq. And I think at this point in time, 4 years into the war, that almost everyone who discusses Iraq has an agenda that's fairly entrenched at this juncture. So I think that certainly the media tries as best as it can to deliver important information about Iraq and cover it as well as it possibly can. So I think that there's a certain amount of Iraq fatigue among the populace, to be honest with you. And I think that, as I said, you really have to read a variety of points of view. You can't necessarily learn everything you need to learn about Iraq from a Pentagon spokesman, clearly, or from a liberal website either. So I think you really, if you seek it out, then I think you can get the news and information you need. The question is, do people really want to seek it out at this point in time?
So what you're really saying is that there is no single truth to be discovered about Iraq.
Yeah, I think that's what I found. I found that everyone views what is happening there. First of all, so much of it is theoretical and speculation. Nobody really knows for sure what would happen if U.S. troops withdrew, or in terms of what kind of civil war would ensue. And I think a lot of it is as I said, theoretical. And so I think many people are still fixated on whether the war was right to begin with and how it was executed in the early stages. And I think—
Katie, what do you mean by theoretical? Because there is so much that is real and actual about what one could see.
In the here and now it is, but I think in terms of speculating and coming up with some kind of game plan in terms of a phased troop withdrawal or maintaining some kind of U.S. security presence for many years to come, or what will actually happen in terms of, will the country implode? Will it be worse than it is now? Will a strongman dictatorship take over if the United States goes out too soon? What role does Iran really have in terms of a power vacuum that might be created? That's what I mean by theoretical. A lot of it is into the future. So
speculative.
Yeah,
really.
Exactly.
What are the areas that you feel the American people ought to know more about concerning this war?
Well, clearly, I think the human toll sometimes gets obscured by the ongoing statistics and kind of the Iraq news that comes out. I think one thing that I was reminded of when I was there was the enormous patriotism and the quality of the people serving over there. When I covered
patriotism of the American troops?
Yes, and the fact that they really do believe, many of them, not all, very strongly in the mission of trying to help the Iraqi people build a better society. Now, whether or not that's doable, there's certainly a difference of opinion among the servicemen and women with whom I spoke. But the extraordinary sacrifice, I think, was something that I was reminded of in 123-degree heat, walking around Baghdad for several hours while they were wearing a tremendous amount of gear and equipment and bulletproof vests. And of course, I almost passed out after an hour with a 30-pound vest myself. And I thought, you know, every day they get out there and do this. And, you know, at this point, we were patrolling Baghdad, and there was relative calm. It's certainly in the areas the military showed me, with good reason. And I think they felt that this new tactic of having joint security stations and being integrated in a neighborhood and being a more ubiquitous presence for not only the local population and kind of hardwiring them against extremism was something that was valuable, was working, and that they felt really positive about. At least that's what they said.
Is there any fault to be placed on anybody, whether it's the generals or the troops or the media or the White House, about the war, because there's such a deep and growing unhappiness about what's going on? You spoke about fatigue, but it's even more than that. There's a feeling of this whole thing is a mess, and we really shouldn't be there. Do you get any of that in Baghdad?
Yeah. There was one U.S. soldier who told me he just didn't know whether democracy was possible in Iraq. And certainly you've heard that from a number of policy experts who feel that it's just not a part of the DNA in Iraq. And I think the one thing I agreed with President Ahmadinejad, that I think he was saying to Charlie Rose last night, was that oftentimes Westerners don't really understand fully the values of this particular culture. And I think the jury is out whether a democracy can really thrive in Iraq, and if there can be political reconciliation among these various sectarian groups.
So that this enormous price is being paid on an expectation, on a belief, on the possibility of a democracy being built in Iraq, when history of Iraq would suggest that it's never happened before.
Well, I think also, you know, I mean, I think sometimes I'm frustrated because the fact of the matter is the U.S. invaded, and the country's infrastructure, which was suffering under Saddam, was very much damaged and in some cases obliterated. Sure. And, you know, I guess it was Colin Powell who quoted the Pottery Barn slogan, "You break it, you take it." And the fact of the matter is, I think you have to deal with the here and now. And I think that's what is lacking in the discourse. What is the solution? What are the possible ramifications if the U.S. withdrew precipitously? And I think those are the kinds of things that we should be hearing from our politicians. And that right now there's so much emphasis, as I said, on whether or not it was a wise decision in the first place. I think certainly people who covered that fell down on the job in terms of getting the right information and kind of rolled over in terms of U.S. policy and really didn't do their due diligence on that in that period of time. Well, I've talked about this a lot with people in the business and thought about it a lot, because I remember at the time the buildup was happening, I felt really uncomfortable with the whole atmosphere of the country. I think, you know, sometimes we forget that people in the press are made up, the press is made up of human beings who experience the same raw emotions, believe it or not automatons. And looking back on it, of course, everyone in the United States was reeling from September 11th. And I think there was a lot of fear in our culture. I think on some level we were looking for some kind of patriarchal hero to help us and protect us. And I think we failed to ask really important questions. And, you know, the whole culture of wearing flags on your lapel and saying we when you're referring to the United States, which, and you know, even the shock and awe in the initial stages, it was just too jubilant and just a little uncomfortable. And I remember feeling, when I was anchoring the Today Show, this inevitable march toward war, and kind of feeling like, will anybody put the brakes on this? And is this being properly challenged by the right people? And I think at the time, anyone who questioned the administration was considered unpatriotic. And it was a very difficult position to be in. And corporate America owning a lot of media outlets, there's a lot of pressure. And I remember getting an email from one of my bosses when I had asked a challenging question of Condoleezza Rice. And he forwarded an angry email from a woman in Atlanta who was an office manager at a law firm, saying I was unnecessarily confrontational and antagonistic. And quite frankly, I thought I was firm but polite. And he forwarded the email to me with no explanation, which I thought was a fairly insidious way of saying back off to me in terms of questioning the administration. So I wrote him back an email and I said, I'm just curious why you forwarded this to me. I try to be equally challenging to everyone I talk to on the show, and if you have a problem with that, I'd love to discuss it with you personally. And he responded that, well, these usually come in big groups, you know, because obviously when there's a certain agenda that's being pursued. I got inundated with emails from James Dobson once when I did the Matthew Shepard story out in Wyoming, the young gay man who had been viciously murdered. And he said this one seemed different, but that was the only explanation. So there was, I think, a lot of kind of undercurrents of pressure to not rock the boat too much for a variety of reasons, whether it was corporate considerations. And, you know, at the time, there was not a lot of questioning about the war by anyone.
What do you think about now? Do you think that the media is doing its job?
Well, I think that's a sweeping question and requires probably a sweeping generalization. So that's probably not fair. I think that media outlets are, in many cases, doing their jobs. As I said, I think the country is so polarized that people see events according to their own agendas and often to their own papers or networks' agenda. I think that the major networks are pretty down the middle, I have to say that. But I had to laugh after General Petraeus testified at the two different headlines that I saw on my desk the next day, with the New York Post, of course, Rupert Murdoch's paper saying that General Petraeus dazzles Congress, and with the New York Times saying he failed to win over any converts. So, you know, I think that, as I said, I guess the best thing you can do, it's very difficult, I think, in this day and age to find pretty down the middle, this is what's happening, that kind of reporting, knowing that you have to make sure it is as balanced as you possibly can. But I think it's harder and harder to find these days. I read The Economist because I think they're pretty down the middle on things. But other than that... But
you're not mentioning any news organization in the United States that you consider right down the middle?
Well, I would say, without the editorial page, possibly the Wall Street Journal. Mm-hmm. But probably that, to me, is the one publication with the least sort of, and maybe Time and Newsweek as well.
But is it necessarily the best kind of journalism to be down the middle if there is something glaringly obvious staring the journalist in the face, that something could be wrong? Right. And then if you just say, stay down the middle, you're allowing what is desperately wrong to continue. No,
obviously, I think when there's something glaringly wrong. But I think there's also, if you want to say the war is glaringly wrong at this point in time, I think if you're covering the news in the present and you're talking about what needs to be done now, what the situation is now, then it's important to observe what's going on and to ask challenging questions. Certainly, You know, the president needs to talk about the GAO report that showed that the Iraqis had only reached 15 of 18 benchmarks, and the General Jones, Jack Jones, the retired general, who found the Iraqi police was in a state of disarray and needed to start from scratch. And officials need to be obviously asked about those things. But unless you're on cable and you're being a very strong advocate for one position or another, I do think there is a place for people to make observations, to ask challenging questions, but let the viewer make a decision. Because I think right now what people do is they watch programs and read publications that reflect their own points of view.
Sure. Yeah.
And they don't necessarily seek out other points of view to kind of give them the full picture.
No. Lately, I've been hearing that the military is again beginning to finger the media as the culprit in this war. And I'm presenting as evidence, but just one very small bit of evidence, the statement by Major General Rick Lynch, who's one of our top people in Iraq. And he said, this war is winnable, his word, if only the media cooperates properly. What's in his mind?
Well, I think that is the oldest trick in the book, of course, to blame the media. I mean, that's, you know, Marvin, that's been happening forever, and I think that that's a sign of probably his desperation.
His only?
Well, probably maybe the other members of the military as well feeling desperate. You know, I think that, you know, it's hard to say. I think it's very difficult to get a complete picture of the situation in Iraq for security reasons. Many reporters don't even leave the green zone. And it's not as if you can walk around knocking on doors. We did speak to an Iraqi family while I was there in central Baghdad about sort of what their quality of life was like on a daily basis. And I was told, thankfully, after that interview that that was probably the most dangerous thing we were going to do during our stay there. So, you know, it is very, very difficult to get the full picture, and you talk to as many experts as you can and get as many opinions as you can. But I know in preparation for this trip, I talked to many people from different think tanks, and, you know, there's a different point of view from almost everyone with whom you speak. So,
is there a different vision of the reality of Iraq here among the think tank people as opposed to there in Baghdad?
What do you mean? You mean
What I mean is, do the people here have the same vision of the reality of Iraq as the people in Baghdad have?
Well,
the
Iraqis themselves?
Or the Americans?
Well, I think everybody obviously deals with their own personal experience. You know, there were the 7 soldiers who wrote the op-ed in the New York Times, and I talked to General Petraeus about that. And, you know, I think it depends on where you're deployed, what your experiences are. I'm really glad they wrote that piece, and it was tragic that 2 of them later died in a car accident shortly after it was published in the New York Times. But I think it really depends on your worldview, your point of view, and your particular experiences if you're in theater, as they say.
You're in effect then sort of rejecting the notion that there could be something in Iraq that is large, glaring, obvious, but what you're saying in effect is that all reporters doing their jobs properly ought to try to balance it.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think that we try to record events as they happen. Right. If Fallujah is happening and 4 contractors are burned to death and dragged through the streets, it's clear to us that, you know, that chaos is ensuing in Fallujah and that the Marines subsequently pull out. Right. I think similarly, if, you know, we go to Anbar province, in the case of when I was there, and we see that there has been some kind of coalition formed between tribal leaders and the U.S. military because of their mutual distrust and hatred, quite frankly, for al-Qaeda, then we talk about that. Now, obviously, I don't take it for face value. There are Sunni tribal leaders there talking about it. And you, I think, as somebody who covered for me, someone who covered the military at the Pentagon, you have to be skeptical about what you're being told and check facts and figures and try to find other sources and other points of view. But is it my job to go over and say, this war is terrible and a withdrawal is necessary immediately? I don't necessarily think that is the case.
Okay. And you may partly be answering the question I'm about to ask you. When you were wrapping up your trip, you did a kind of concluding statement of 2.5 minutes, as I remember, from Damascus. And what struck me about it is that you offered only one judgment about the war, and you cushioned that, by the way. You said, quote, there are definitely areas where the situation is improving. Fine. But you then asked 9 questions, and this is what struck me about the piece. You asked 9 questions, 9 important questions about Iraq. But you didn't even make an effort to answer them. And so I'm wondering why. If you raise 9 important questions, you have been there. You're an anchor every night. You see the material flows into you. Surely on some of those 9 issues, you must have had a strong feeling.
You know,
maybe you didn't.
I don't think this was my Walter Cronkite moment to say this war is bad. You know, I don't think I do have the answers to those questions, quite frankly. Mm-hmm. I wish I did. I don't think spending 5 or 6 days in Iraq necessarily makes me or qualifies me to answer those 9 questions. Mm-hmm. I think many of them were forward-looking. I don't really know, Marvin. I wish I did what will happen in terms of Iran if the United States pulls out of Iraq. I don't know the answer to that. I hope, do you?
No.
So I don't know many people, quite frankly, who would know the answers to the questions I posed. I think my goal was...
But the government has said things that suggest that the government does know the answer.
I don't think so. I don't think so necessarily. I mean, I think that obviously the administration still feels that democracy is possible.
In Iran?
In Iraq, I'm sorry, in Iraq,
okay.
Yeah. And were you talking about Iran?
We were both talking about Iran for a moment.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that obviously there is clear evidence that there has been some kind of meddling with Iran and with Shiite militias in southern Iraq.
Right.
But I mean, I'd love you to read back the questions, and if you could answer any of them, or if even, most experts could, I would be very, very impressed.
We'll try. We will try. But then what is your definition of the modern role of an anchor? Is an anchor today to be the person who reads lead-ins and smiles happily and is the soul of detached objectivity?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
That's it. No opinions.
Of course not. Obviously, I have opinions. And I think the goal is to try to seek out the truth. Mm-hmm. That, speaking to your earlier contention about sort of being straight down the middle doesn't necessarily mean on one hand they say this, on the other hand they say that, and you all make the decision. Obviously, you want, through seeking facts, try to ascertain a certain truth about a certain story. But I think there's a lot of advocacy journalism and commentary out there today. Yes, there is. And I don't necessarily feel, unless there is a clear-cut factual element to it, that an anchor person, and it depends, God knows there are a million anchors and a million different media outlets in this day and age, but I have never really saw it as my role, unless something is really egregious and without question wrong. And for example, when David Duke was on the Today Show, I remember, he denied that he said Jews belong in the ash bin of whatever, of society. Mm-hmm. And I actually, I was very tough on him, to the surprise, I think, of many people, because it was in my early days at the Today Show. And, I think when someone is so clearly wrong, that it is an anchor's responsibility. When we covered the bridge collapse in Minneapolis, we talked about crumbling infrastructure and the fact that they had built a hugely expensive stadium in Minneapolis instead of paying attention to bridges and roads, and that's certainly a problem that's a real epidemic in this country. Yes, I feel like then you can speak out and say that pretty much with certainty. I think you need to be careful, though, quite frankly, in coming down on certain positions when it's unclear. I mean, I think it's accepted far and wide that this war was probably that this might not have been on the president's top of his agenda, and that people have questioned, what was really behind this. And I think it's been very well documented.
I understood that last sentence. What do you mean by that?
Well, that the war might have been a mistake. I think that's pretty much accepted.
Do you have a personal opinion about that?
I don't. I've never quite understood why it was so high on the administration's agenda when terrorism was going on in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and that it had no true connection with Al-Qaeda. Now, there was talk of that early on, and still many people in this country believe there is a connection between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. And I think, obviously, I think everyone in this room would agree that people in this country were misled in terms of the rationale for war. I think that's clear. Did you just say that
there is a connection?
There is not a connection between Iraq and September 11th. Ironically, there is now between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, which is interesting, I guess. But and I think that the mistakes that were made disbanding the Iraqi military and leaving 100,000 Sunni men feeling marginalized and angry was questionable. Whether or not there were enough boots on the ground, the feeling that we would be welcomed as liberators and didn't need to focus as much on maintaining security. I mean, I think those things are accepted truths, and I feel totally comfortable saying any of that at some point, if required on television. But I think everybody is sort of operating from that context. What I try to deal with in covering news is what's happening today, here and now, and how this country is going to be able to deal with it.
Okay. Let me pause for a moment to remind our viewers and listeners that this is the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb. We're here at the National Press Club, and I'm talking with Katie Couric. Katie, I'd like to ask you about the so-called new media. Many of the students in this audience get most of the news about the world from the internet. And that poses a huge competitive challenge for the networks, Do you think it's possible that in, let's say, 5 or 10 years down the road, that a program such as the CBS Evening News will not be there because it's too expensive to produce and there will be too few people watching? They'll all be on the internet in one way or another. How do you see this meshing of the old and the new media and looking toward the future and not that far out, how would it affect your program?
Well, obviously, that's something that all the networks and many media outlets, cable television too, everyone is dealing with that eventuality, and I think that's how they view it, as an eventuality. The fact of the matter is that hopefully content will still matter. That's what old media types say, that content is king, and you still need to have programming and credible reporting and accurate information on the internet. A lot of the information you get is, some guy in his pajamas using a laptop spewing his personal opinion, and not very politely, I might add, on a variety of subjects. So I think that the real challenge will be, how do you deliver news and information in an important and accurate way on the internet, and whether it will be
in place of what you're doing now, or in addition to that?
Well, I think that it's sort of a generational thing. I see my daughters; they never watch well, they do watch television. They watch the OC, and they're very excited about Gossip Girl, but But, you know, in terms of regular television viewing, news viewing, I don't think they pay a ton of attention to the news right now. They're 16 and 11. They do watch my broadcast occasionally, and I give them a pop quiz when I come home for dinner. But I think that there still will be a role. It's just going to, I think it's anyone's guess, Marvin, what exactly that'll look like in terms of how we'll make the transition to the internet. I think it's a real question.
It is indeed. I mean, it's the big sort of technological media question before us all. When you first arrived at CBS last year, you were on the cover of Newsweek, which I have right here in front of me. And part of that was the big hype thing that was going on at the time. And the questions that were put on the cover of Newsweek were, will she shine at night, and who will watch? Now, that was obviously a reference to your great success on the Today program. Inside, the magazine seemed to answer its own questions, and it wrote, quote, CBS is hoping Katie will draw new viewers, but the real action in TV news may be happening on the web, unquote. So is the real action on the web? I mean, do you feel the ground kind of being pulled out from under you now?
I don't know if it's the ground being pulled out from under me, but you definitely sense a transition going on in the way media is consumed.
Sure.
There's absolutely no question about it. And many of my colleagues, we talk about it, and they don't watch morning shows as much. They check on their computers to kind of get a early morning fill, to get kind of a sort of smattering of different outlets, and then they're on their way. So I would say for all of you aspiring journalists that obviously the internet is the wave of the future, already has become a hugely important asset in the media. And, you know, I sort of knew that when I took this job. You know, I didn't say, oh, good, I'm going to work on the evening news, which has a growing audience. I mean, I knew it was a dwindling audience. I knew it was an aging audience, quite frankly. And I knew that, you know, that it would decline in numbers, and that it would not quite have the stature that it once had with Tom and Peter and Dan. At the same time, I thought it was a very important genre. Some 27 million people watch it every night. The median age is, yes, 60. And many of my friends and people that I spend time with aren't at home to watch it at 6:30 at night, or in some cases on the West Coast. I think in Seattle it runs at 5:30. It's very difficult, I think, and I think the way people live, our lifestyles are very different too. That's why morning shows, I think I read recently that people are getting up much earlier, they're going to bed much earlier as well, and they're working longer hours, which, you know, I think that our lifestyle also is having a big impact on the way news and information is consumed.
You have many friends, many friends, who say that the American people are not yet ready for a woman anchor. You've heard that conversation 100 times. That there's an underlying discomfort in many minds about the idea of a woman delivering a very serious newscast. And that they say that that is the reason, the principal reason, why your ratings have dipped. Do you agree with that?
No, you know, wow, okay. Well, I think there probably remains in this country an underlying discomfort with any women in positions of power. I think that that there are some people that don't feel completely comfortable with that. But I wouldn't say that's the only reason probably that I've had certain challenges. I think some of them are...
What are the other reasons?
I'm getting to those, Marvin. Some of them are out of...
I wanted to encourage you.
Some of them, thank you, I appreciate it. Some of them are out of my control, some of the things that we just talked about in terms of the way media is consumed in this country, lifestyle issues. I think probably, you know, David Gregory, a friend of mine, said it's almost like you got almost two, this sounds kind of weird, but you became almost too well known and too much of a personality to kind of fit into a 22-minute broadcast. I think maybe perhaps on the Today Show, where I felt very, very proud of a lot of my work there, and I probably have interviewed more world leaders and public figures than many of my colleagues. Having said that, I think the fact that the Today Show was a real mix of segments, and that 1 minute we might be doing an interview with the Vice President or Joe Biden on the 9/11 Commission, and in the next half hour we might be doing something very, very light and different, and at times quite frivolous. But you know, some of the lighter segments I think were interesting, even some of the medical segments and women's health segments that might not be traditionally hard news, I think were really important in many ways. And I tried to bring the same you know, level of importance and commitment to those segments, not obviously the fashion shows and cooking segments. And, you know, if I did another wedding, I was just gonna, what ring do you think the bride should pick? So I felt a little like a game show host on some of those things. But I think that they probably gave people the impression that I wasn't a serious person because they saw me do the mix of things. And so suddenly when I was put in a format where I could really have, it was very, no personality driven really at all, I think it was a bit of an adjustment for people. They were like, what happened to her? You know, she used to be fun and, you know, say funny things, and it was just a very different role for me. And I think it took and is taking people a while to get their heads around that.
Well, your boss, Leslie Moonves, hired you, and he said that he wanted to change the evening news completely. No more, he said, voice of God stuff, going back to my generation. None of that anymore. That you were going to try a whole new approach. But that approach didn't work.
Well, I think, first of all, I think Leslie his quotes were exaggerated, I think, to be honest with you. Yeah, I mean, I think he talked about voice of God. I mean, at one point, he made a joke about blowing up CBS News and changing everything. And I think what we wanted to do was to make the news more accessible, a little more understandable, a little more casual, less sort of, less traditional if we could, to say, here's what's going on in Iraq, and if you're confused about this, we're going to explain to you the difference between Sunnis and Shiites. Or, you know, just to try different things. And I think what we found, quite frankly, was that this is a very traditional audience that really wants a traditional newscast.
And that's what you're giving them now.
Yeah, I think so. And Rick and I have talked about it, my executive producer, and you know, he said, I wish you would talk to me because we've tried to change the evening news before and it just never works. And I think that the conundrum is, are you willing to really make a change and risk alienating your core audience, i.e. people of the average age of 60 who want a traditional newscast, for an audience that may not exist at that hour of the day? So I think that was the big conundrum, and I think that...
Have you solved that?
No.
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 So you've gone back to the traditional newscast now?
Yes, we have.
And the question that I think flows from that is, given your enthusiasm for the earlier format, are you a happy camper now doing this more traditional role? At
times, you know, I get frustrated because I love interacting with people. I like reporting. I really enjoyed going to Iraq and talking to people, whether it was the Iraqi family or various military officials. And I think that's what where my skills really lie. And I think if I can do pieces like that, and I also really enjoy the editorial process, talking about how we can do pieces differently. I'd like to stretch the envelope a little more, quite frankly, Rick, and you know, try some new things. But I think that we wanted to say, listen, for those who didn't think we were, and by the way, I didn't think anything we did in the early days necessarily said we're not serious broadcasters. We did longer pieces.
No,
we did something called free speech.
Right.
We had probably fewer stories because we had longer stories, but I think, quite frankly, the whole notion that we were so light isn't really borne out in the shows that we did. And I would, that's okay, but that's sort of been the conventional wisdom and the party line of people who were initially critical. And I thought, you know, to try something like free speech, which was the product of a conversation that we had sitting around talking, was something that was worthwhile. And, you know, we always said at the beginning, we're going to try things, some will work, some won't. But the thing is, if they don't work, then people forget that you said some might not work.
Exactly. How long do you see yourself in this anchor role that you're in right now? And I ask the question because I read somewhere, and forgive me, but I don't remember the exact location, that you may be thinking of giving up the anchor slot next year after the election, going full-time to 60 Minutes.
That's not true.
Not true, okay. I noticed that when you were in, well, the previous question. Do you and your esteemed executive producer, Rick Kaplan, who's sitting right there, do you guys have, Rick is one of the most imaginative people in this business. I admire him immensely. You're a first-class pro. Can you put together a plan that will boost your ratings?
Well, we hope that if we continue to do quality work and to be forward-thinking and to come up with different ways of doing stories, that obviously we'd like more people to watch. Right. I, frankly, have never been obsessed with ratings. I probably should be more than I am, but at the Today Show, I felt that some of our best years were when we were number 2, and we were taking risks and trying things and kind of playing with the format.
Forgive me, but you know what you sound like now?
What?
You sound like the politician who says, I never look at polling data. I never look at polling data.
Well, it happens to have the benefit of being true. You know,
that's a great line. That's Henry Kissinger's line.
You know, clearly I would like more people to watch. Rick would like more people to watch. But we also feel, you know, every time someone comes up to me and says, you know, I really like you or I admire you, his first question is, are you a Nielsen family? And, but having said that, you know, more than 6 million people are watching every night. That's an extraordinarily high number, and I feel really honored that that many people are entrusting us to give them their news.
I don't have to tell you that you're sitting in Walter Cronkite's chair.
Now?
Now. It's a big responsibility, but you're also sitting in Dan Rather's chair, and Dan was in that chair for 24 years. Now he's suing your boss, CBS, for $70 million.
Really?
Yeah. Claiming that CBS treated him very shabbily, hurt his professional reputation, went after him only because it didn't want to offend the Bush administration. And I'm wondering, as you think about this, what your initial response is. What do you think Dan is up to, and do you think there's some merit in what he's trying to do?
I think Dan had an extraordinary career, and I think he was a fine journalist and a hardworking person. I always admired and respected him. I was not there when this happened, but of course I followed it. And I think that he made a mistake. And whether, I don't know how, if it was handled completely properly. I mean, I think there were a lot of behind-the-scenes machinations going on during that period of time. Certainly a panel of people, some of whom I respect a great deal, and the others I just don't know who they are at this point in time, reviewed it. And I think they did not dot their I's and cross their T's when it came to that story. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are very few network executives, I don't know what your experience is, Marvin, who deal with difficult decisions or making changes or telling someone that they're no longer needed in a civil, appropriate, and kind way. And all I can tell you is that I was very sad to see Dan Rather's career end this way. And I can't really speak of his motives now. And I really don't feel I'm well-versed enough to have an opinion either way.
Okay. Koppel said the other day that he felt very sorry for Dan, and it was a very painful process that he is obviously going through. But Ted said that in his judgment, the story that Dan did about the president receiving favorable treatment and staying out of service in Vietnam by going to the Texas Air National Guard, that was, I think Ted's exact words were, more true than not. And that there was obviously a mistake with some of the documentation. But the basic thrust of the story, Dan argues, is still correct. And we've all done stories where a piece of it may not be exactly right, but the thrust of it is. And what is your sense of that?
I think that that's probably true, but I think that when you're doing although again, I don't know all the specifics, but when you're making these kinds of allegations, you have to be you have to back them up completely.
Super careful.
With information, and I think that there was some sloppy work done, and there's, sloppy work is sloppy work. Now, whether that somehow obscures the actual story, it doesn't really matter, because our job is to get it right. And I think there were things in there that were quite egregious in terms of how it was reported.
What was egregious?
Well, I think, again, you're asking me to kind of relive this whole chapter, but I think, in terms of the person who was analyzing the font, again, I can't really get into it, was not a reliable individual, and that came through during the investigation. But again, I don't really feel comfortable kind of rehashing this whole thing.
Then let me move you on to a far more comfortable subject. Do you feel that we may be approaching that time when large corporations are increasingly anxious not to offend the government, particularly, and this takes you back to what you were saying about 30 minutes ago, particularly when you're in a wartime situation, when nerves are very on edge? And you wonder right now whether these corporations don't want to lose government contracts. And they do own many, many media. And as a matter of fact, all over the world today, the story of the last 20 years is that more and more of the media end up in the hands of fewer and fewer corporations. So do you sense a danger that these large corporations are going to begin to eat in on your own editorial freedom? I
think that, first of all, I think that existed several years ago. This is not necessarily a new phenomenon. And I think that there is, what I mentioned earlier, sort of insidious pressure, or sort of an undercurrent of pressure. I still believe there is a lot of journalistic independence, even given the corporate ownership, in some cases, of media outlets. I think there are other cases where you have to toe the party line of a certain corporation. But I think that most of my colleagues feel that they have complete freedom. I think, again, during the build-up to the war, there were some sort of, I felt kind of a subtle pressure. And I remember one network executive gave a thumbs up when Bush won Florida during the election coverage, which I thought was really grossly inappropriate. But I think that, for the most part, there is a lot of journalistic independence still.
I totally agree. Totally agree. We're on the same page there. However,
yes.
Do you sometimes worry that you, as an anchor, are too busy, that you're doing too many things, that you are giving responsibility to staff people to write things, and you got into trouble once on a plagiarism thing when one of the writers picked up some stuff from the Wall Street Journal and didn't credit it? Do you feel, I mean, for example, Rather, at the time of the story that we were talking about, argues, and probably accurately, that he was overwhelmed with preparation for the conventions and the election and a storm in Florida and all of that stuff. An anchor can do the evening news without doing everything else. And as you have examined over the last year, do you find yourself being crowded being asked to do too many things, running a risk that you may not be in control of what goes out on the air under Katie Couric's name?
Yeah, I think there's always the risk of that. Certainly, it's something that I pay attention to. When I'm working on a 60 Minutes piece and I'm traveling, perhaps doing an interview and coming back to do the evening news, and I haven't been as plugged in as I might otherwise be, that's something for me to consider. I think that obviously I trust Rick implicitly. We talk a lot during the course of a day, but it's something I'm mindful of and careful of. And you're right, it was a problem several months ago when, you know, I was doing notebooks and we were talking about different topics, and we had probably 3 or 4 people in the meetings kind of brainstorming and coming up with things, and I wrote some and other people wrote some, and then I would edit them. And, you know, I think in those cases, you're right, ultimately I'm responsible, and I think that it's an imperative that you have experienced, ethical people who you can trust in some of those roles. But
doesn't it make more sense, maybe it doesn't, make more sense for you because it's your face out there, it's your responsibility, your reputation.
Right.
Why entrust it to somebody else? Why not write your own copy?
Well,
with the other people.
I do a lot of times, but you know, there are only so many minutes in a day, and some of these notebooks require a great deal of research. You're not just sort of saying for 54 seconds, this is what I think about X, Y, and Z. It requires calling certain experts, getting certain material.
You tell us what you think.
Yeah, no, I know, but we talk about it, and I give them their marching orders, and we say, I'd like to do a story on the MacArthur Genius Grants and how impressive these people are and how they need to get more attention. And I'll even give them some lines. And a lot of times I do write them myself. But, you know, I might say, I need you to call Richard Haas at the Council on Foreign Relations if you get a chance, because I may be running across to do 60 Minutes. So you're right. You know, it's something that you have to be exceedingly careful about.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, and I want to ask you a couple of questions that students ask me to ask you. And one of them is, how does one succeed in this business? And I have to tell you the great story about Dan Shore, who was sitting right
there.
Dan, right there. When Dan went from newspapering to CBS, he asked somebody, what is the secret of success? How do you succeed here? And the somebody said, sincerity. If you can fake that, you've got it made. Putting that aside, and everybody should forget that story, what then was your secret of success?
I think that I really love what I do. I like the nuts and bolts of what goes into what I do. I love to write. I like to talk to people. I'm naturally curious. And I think because of that, it's a really good fit for me to have done this for a living. And I think that I always tell people they have to do what they're passionate about. And they also have to take a good, hard look at their own unique skills or the skills they lack and be realistic about that when they're figuring out what they're going to do.
Another question that I'm asked to ask you is, how do you put up with all of the pressure that you're under every single day?
Well, I think part of it is because I have a really healthy foundation, thanks to my parents. I have a very healthy sense of who I am, and believe it or not, still a lot of self-confidence in my abilities. And my work is exceedingly important to me, but not as important as my children and my family. And it's one important part of my life, but I think I just have a very healthy perspective, and I'm a very grounded person for whatever reason, probably because of my parents.
Terribly important, too. Do you have enough time to read a book that has nothing to do with politics in Iraq?
Yeah.
Like what?
I'm reading Eat, Pray, Love right now, like everyone else in America. And I'm finally into India because I got sick of Italy and all the food. It just made me hungry every time I read that. And so that's what I'm reading right now.
Do you have private time, much of it?
Yeah, I do. Mm-hmm. Like
even
on the
with
weekends.
the schedule?
Yeah, well, I enjoy my weekends. I try to do new, fun things.
Do you get out of New York?
Yeah, I do.
You go to the movies?
I do. I go to the movies. I went to Becoming Jane with my daughter Ellie, who's read a lot of Jane Austen novels, and yeah, I really make time to enjoy my life. That's really important to me. I think having a husband who died at 42 and a sister who died at 54, I realized the importance of finding joy sort of on a daily basis.
Katie, I am really sorry I have to interrupt this conversation because I have a feeling we could go on for a lot longer, but it's the tyranny of the clock once again. But I want you to look around. There are hundreds of students in this room, and I think they join me in saying thank you, Katie Couric, for coming here, sharing some time with us, and talking to us. I'm Marvin Kalb. Good night and good luck.
The Kalb Report is produced by the George Washington University, the National Press Club, and the Joan Shorenstein Center at Harvard University. The series is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation.